Early in December 1941, Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, withered in the face of tenacious Soviet resistance and one of the worst Russian winters in living memory. The exhausted German army was woefully unprepared for the bitter cold, which struck down man, beast, and machine alike. Soldiers froze to death or were crippled by frostbite while their draft horses perished by the thousands. Lubricants and fuel froze, firing pins snapped, tanks refused to start, machine guns fired no more, and aircraft were grounded. At dawn on December 5th and 6th, the fury of a Soviet counteroffensive sent the heretofore unbeaten Wehrmacht reeling back from the threshold of Moscow. At times in panic, at times in good order, the German army was on the retreat. Behind their rear guard, nothing was to be left to the Red Army. Wilhelm Goebel of the 78th Infantry Division witnessed the entire horizon glowing red from the fires of burning villages, their hapless inhabitants left to freeze or starve to death. This was particularly tragic since the Russian peasants, who had no love for the communists, had welcomed the Germans' liberators into their homes. Retreat is a hard pill to swallow. For the troopers of the 2nd SS Motorized Division des Reich, the order to fall back on December 9th was a hard pill to swallow. Only 5 days earlier, Noir 1 company of their Kradschützen motorcycle battalion had reached the end of the Moscow tramway system. Although dirty, unshaven, freezing, and plagued by lice, the SS troopers thought only of continuing the attack toward Moscow. When the Soviet counteroffensive hit them, the Deutschland Regiment painted the snow brown with swaths of machine-gun Soviet soldiers. Yet there was no escaping the inevitable. The division first fell back across the river Istra, then the river Rusa. By December 16th, Das Reich found itself ordered to withdraw all the way back to Kshatsk, more than 60 miles west of Moscow. The German front threatened to dissolve like Napoleon's Grande Armée had over a century ago. As General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, put it, "The German soldier does not go kaput." Around the towns and villages of the principal railways and roads, the German hedgehogs fended off the oncoming Soviet formations like squares of pikemen had defied enemy cavalry in an earlier age. The panzer divisions acted like fire brigades to seal off Soviet breaches. Nevertheless, for Army Group Center, AGC, the Soviet counteroffensive developed into a nightmare. Stalin tasted victory and craved more. Surely now was the time to crush the weakened Nazi invader in a general winter offensive along the entire front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The main blow would come against AGC, where the Germans had not yet had time to recover from their setback at Moscow. Soviet fronts, army groups, would slice open the northern and southern flanks of AGC. They would converge at Vyazma on the motor highway west of Moscow, the great supply artery of AGC. The bulk of AGC would be encircled, cut off, and annihilated. The northern arm of the great Soviet pincer, General Ivan S. Konev's Kalinin Front, bludgeoned its way through the German lines west of the Rzhev hedgehog. The move severed 23rd Corps from 6th Corps and the rest of 9th Army and threatened the Rzhev-Sychevka-Vyazma railway line. The 9th Army was in shambles and faced destruction. To its rescue came its new commander, General of Panzer Troops Walther Model. Model takes command. At Army headquarters, Model was asked, "What reserves have you brought us?" Model retorted, "Myself." It was no mere bravado. The short and wiry general invigorated the demoralized troops with his own unshakable energy and optimism. Model spent about an hour each day poring over his maps and 10 hours visiting his troops. Paul Carrel wrote, "Where he came, he worked like a battery that recharged the spent energies of the commanders. At times, pistol in hand, he even led assaults against the enemy. Almost miraculously, He managed to close the gap between the 23rd and 6th Corps and secure the Rzhev-Sychevka-Vyazma railway line. Closing the gap was one thing. Holding it was another matter entirely. 9 Soviet rifle divisions and 3 to 4 cavalry divisions now lay isolated behind German lines. Ivan Maslenikov's 39th Army and Vasily I. Shvetov's 29th Army would fight like trapped wolves to break free. Indeed, they continued to press toward their objective at Vyazma, still hoping to link up with the Soviet pincer battling its way north. To stop them, the 46th Panzer Corps, with the bulk of DA's Reich in the 5th Panzer Division, the 1st Panzer Division, and the 86th Infantry Division, counterattacked to envelop the 2 Soviet armies in a gigantic cauldron west of Sychevka-Vyazma. Meanwhile, west of Rzhev, Vasily A. Khomenko's 30th Army would use everything at its disposal to tear a fresh breach between the 9th Army's 23rd and 6th Corps and re-establish contact with the 29th Army. Hitler insisted that an SS regiment bear the brunt of the Soviet relief attacks. There was really only one available, Das Reichs der Führer, DF, which at the time was not engaged. The regiment was placed under the command of the 256th Infantry Division, 6th Corps, and deployed at the very position where the Soviets previously breached the German lines. Here, foreboding 9-foot-wide tank tracks still marked 2 Soviet snow roads across the frozen Volga River. Model tells, "Come to hold at all costs." Model had utter confidence in the men of DF and their leader, Obersturmbannführer, Colonel Otto Kump. He had to. On them ultimately hinged the success or failure of the winter battle of Rzhev. However, from an original strength of around 3,000, DF's ranks had depleted to only 650 men. They would rely greatly on their heavy and light infantry guns and 37 mm pack anti-tank guns. Would those be enough to stem the oncoming red tide? "Hold at all costs," repeated a solemn Model to Kump. "Jawohl, Herr General," saluted Kump. Der Führer's 4-mile front faced northward and through it, southeast to northwest, snaked the Volga River. The 1st Battalion of DF, IDF, held the west side of the river, with its headquarters, HQ, at Opaccino. The 3rd DF held the front east of the river, its HQ at Klepenino. The remnants of DF's 2nd Battalion had been disbanded earlier. The front line ran along the village strongpoints of Solomino, Klepenino, Opaccino, Kokosh. The troopers used mines and cartridges to blast holes for machine guns and infantry dugouts at intervals of 100 to 200 yards. To the south, more villages and smaller woodlands ringed the large Kulisenwald. Regimental HQ was in Noshkino, south of the Kulisenwald. To the west, DF was flanked by units of the 206th Infantry Division, 23rd Corps, and to the east by the 161st Infantry Division and the 471 Infantry Regiment, IR, 6th Corps. Probes by IDF on January 26th found no enemy activity on its side of the river. Sturmbannführer, Lone Colonel. Irath mined the main roads through Paikowo on the river's southern bank. In the morning, elements of IDF crossed the Volga and drove the Soviets out of Svetlino. In order to render it useless as an enemy base, the SS troopers leveled the village to the ground before withdrawing. Security positions were left at Paikowo and its western neighbor Krutiki. On the eastern side of the river, things did not go so well. The Soviets were well entrenched in a wooded hilltop to the north. German efforts to dislodge them were hurled back in a ferocious counterattack that claimed the life of the battalion commander, Hauptsturmführer, Captain Schultz. German artillery and machine gun fire stopped the pursuing Soviets cold. Model made sure he stayed in constant personal touch with Kump. When his vehicle was unable to break through the snow, He resorted to a Fieseler Storch aircraft and once even arrived on horseback. On January 27th, Model was conferring with 23rd and 6th Corps commanders at DF's headquarters when reports came in from IDF. The enemy is attacking this side of the Volga, from the northwest toward Solomino with strong forces, around 1,000 men. This was the latest of several skirmishes along DF's entire front line that had begun before midnight and lasted until the early hours of dawn. Up until 10:30 hours, enemy forces, including the first armor sightings, congregated in strength in front of Klepanino. An icy wind swept over the Volga River as DF's companies remained on constant alert, their weapons battle-ready. The Germans prepare for an onslaught from the Soviet 30th Army. In heavy snowfall at 0200 hours on the 28th, the Soviets assailed Klepanino and Opaccino and did not let up until dusk. So far, the enemy had been repulsed everywhere. However, a captured Soviet radio operator confirmed that the entire 30th Army, 7 rifle divisions and 6 tank brigades, stood ready to begin their attack the next morning. Contact was to be re-established with the 29th Army to the south, no matter what the cost. Model, who happened to be there when the prisoner was brought in, took his leave of DF headquarters with the words, "Come, I'm depending on you," and then added with a smile, "But maybe Ivan has swindled us." Model's optimism proved unfounded. The next morning, the Soviet 30th Army launched its attacks in earnest. Karel tells of how the Soviets hurled battalion after battalion, regiment after regiment, and finally brigade after brigade at DF's position, but typically failed to commit their strength on a single focal point. The Soviets attacked for 3 long weeks, day and night. Come describe the nature of the fighting. The heroism of the men in those days by far exceeds anything accomplished so far. Every attack is broken at the cost of fearful casualties, often in close combat with grenades and sidearms. Mounds of enemy dead pile up in front of the company positions. Most horrible of all are the attacks by enemy tanks. Around Klepanino, the enemy armor quickly became too much for the fatigued troopers of 9DF, 9th Company. On the 29th, troops from Przgabt 561, Tank Hunter Group, were sent in to support the defense. The Panzerjägers were only one of many units that would have to be rushed in to support the depleted ranks of DF. Through snowstorms and temperatures that sank to 46 degrees below 0 centigrade, the SS troopers held their lines against an equally determined enemy. Such cold froze a man's breath. Possession of a village could make the difference between life and death. Overheated from combat, troops that spent the night in snow pits suffered from frostbitten toes and feet. In one instance, Soviets were so stiff and weak after a night outside that they were unable to hinder a German withdrawal even though the Germans passed within 100 yards. Another feature of winter combat was that deep snow reduced the effectiveness of artillery. Snow dampened and reduced shrapnel spray and could nearly nullify mortar rounds and grenades. Mines could fail to detonate when driven over by vehicles. All night long, there droned from above the sound of Soviet planes on their way to drop supplies to their beleaguered comrades in the cauldron. Although 7 of their tanks were destroyed between Klepanino and Kokosh on the 30th, Soviet armor steamrolled over 3 machine gun positions east of Klepanino. By 1800 hours, the Soviets entered the eastern part of the village. The soldiers of 9DF, reduced to 30 men by 2200 hours, were hard-pressed to expel the enemy. From along the entire front, grim reports of company strengths reduced to 20 to 30 men trickled into DFHQ. Soviet units had penetrated as far as Timanzewo and infiltrated the Kulisenwald. To restore the situation, the EI/471 sent infantry regiment with 4 Sturmgeschütze assault guns of Oberleutnant, First Lieutenant, Wilhelm von Malachowski's 2 Stugeschaft 189, the Ritter-Adler Brigade, was placed under the command of D.F. Malachowski had just been awarded the Knight's Cross, to which he was destined to add the Oak Leaves. Das Reich had lost the last of its own Sturmgeschütze in the bitter fighting around the cauldron over the previous 2 days. 32 unlucky officers and soldiers from the dissolved Sturmgeschütze battery were to be used as infantry for DF, while others were sent to panzer courses in Vienna or transferred to Prague. On January 31st at 11:10 hours, the assault guns rolled into action through a flurry of snow. They supported the I/471 St. Infantry Regiment and 2 companies of the 256th Infantry Division as they counterattacked to secure the area between Klepanino and Opaccino. Tank-to-tank duels developed in which 3 Soviet tanks were left burning. The remainder retired into the woods to the north. Whenever they dared re-emerge from the thickets, the fire from the lurking Sturmgeschütze drove them back. The 256th Infantry Division further stiffened Klepanino's defense with the 3 256th Pioneer Company. Alongside 9 DF and the guns of PZ Jogabt 561, the pioneers were able to fend off renewed Soviet penetrations north of the village. By February 3rd, the 1350 mm pack guns of Lieutenant, Second Lieutenant, Peterman's PZ Jogabt 561 had tallied 20 T-34S destroyed. At nearly 4,000 feet per second, the 50 mm Pack's AP-40 shell could penetrate 56 mm of armor sloped 30 degrees at a distance of 1,000 yards. Burned-out T-34S had hopelessly blocked one of the gun's views. Snowed into its axles, its crew could not move the gun. Neither could any vehicle make it through the snow and tow the gun to a new position. A 30-ton T-34 then flattened another pack. More and more, the grenadiers and pioneers relied on mines and Molotov cocktails to disable the Soviet tanks. Eastward from Klepanino, a renewed Soviet assault undid the gains of January 31st and broke through to the Kulisenwald. A hurricane of Soviet artillery fire played such havoc with German radio communications that the Soviet gains remained unreported at DF's HQ. The resulting situation became so desperate that Das Reich fed 200 men of its own artillery regiment into the battle as infantry. The German defense at Opaccino finally cracks. On February 3rd, the German defense at Opaccino finally cracked. 30 to 40 T-34S closed in on the position of 10 DF. From 100 feet, 3 or 4 tanks systematically blazed away at each machine gun nest and foxhole. After 30 minutes, the rending noise of metal tracks faded away as the steel juggernauts crept back into the woods. Deathly silence hovered over the battlefield. Hours later, a mortally wounded man staggered into the 3rd DF's HQ. It was Rottenführer, Corporal Wagner, who collapsed and with his last words uttered, "Hauptsturmführer, Captain, I am the last of the company. All the others are dead." A 1,000 yard hole now gaped in DF's front line. Cum pleaded for reinforcements from 6th Corps, but all that was immediately available was an ad hoc company of 120 drivers, cooks, and tailors led by paymasters. Having no other choice, Cum reluctantly deployed the new reinforcements in the former positions of the 10th Company. Soon after, the Soviets attacked with grenades and their blood-curdling "Ura! Ura!" cry. The nerves of the hastily raised German company immediately snapped and they bolted to the rear. Soviet gunfire mowed them down in the open snow. Despite heavy artillery barrages and renewed Soviet attacks, the German defenses at Klepanino continued to hold. East of the village, the Soviets swept toward the Kulisenwald in strength. German pioneer and construction troops, who strove to prepare a new defensive line, were surprised and blasted to bits. By the morning of February 4th, Soviet units had crossed the woods and stood a mere 50 yards from DF Regimental HQ. All remaining men, including adjutants, officers, radio operators, and drivers, toiled like devils to prepare the village's 8 buildings for defense. Pits were dug in the floors and firing slits cut into the lower beams of the walls. For 3 days, the Soviets ceaselessly attacked, the gunfire of their tanks turning the houses to rubble. Hauptsturmführer Holzer was everywhere, inspiring the men to hold fast, and hold fast they did. The Soviet attack temporarily blunted. The remaining 2 companies of IIR 456 were thrown into the fray. One company struck northwest from Noshkino, along the road on the north bank of Volga that led to Klepanino. Before they reached the latter village, Soviets attacked from out of the woods and bogged down the company. A second company struck northeast for Timanzewo, but a Soviet company also intercepted them. Bullets whistled through the air, and many Germans were cut down. Only their leader and 12 grenadiers managed to reach Timanzewo. Subsequent German frontal and flank assaults on February 5th and 6th achieved little other than further thinning the German ranks. Soviet elements even crossed the Volga to take positions in a small wood and village, respectively nicknamed the Russian Grove and the Kirchdorf. Mummert's arrival drives the Soviets out of Kirchdorf. Fortunately for the Germans, substantial reinforcements in the form of AA 256 Reconnaissance Battalion, under the brilliant leadership of Major Mummert, arrived at Noshkino. Mummert's men drove the Soviets out of the Kirchdorf, and around midnight made decisive headway in the Russian Grove. February 6 was no less an eventful day for IDF on the western side of the Volga. The advance units at Paikowo and its neighboring village of Krutiki had long since been pulled back to strengthen the main defense at Solomino. After clearing mines and snow, the Soviets hit IDF in full force. That day, all of 2DF followed 10DF to the grave. Aided by a hail of artillery fire, the remaining grenadiers of IDF managed to hold on. By the end of the 6th, DF was down to a total of 226 men, and AA 256 down to just 150 men. P-Beetle 256 only had 68 men, while 52 men remained with PSJ-Gapt 561. There were less than 20 anti-tank and infantry guns left, only 3 of which were 50 mm packs. The remaining 37 mm packs were so useless against the thick, sloped armor of the T-34S that the Germans nicknamed them door knockers. Facing DF were elements of the 363rd, 359th, 371st, and 375th Soviet Rifle Divisions and the 21st and 58th Tank Brigades. Between Klepanino and Timanzewo, a giant dent had been smashed into the DF's front line, threatening to outflank Noshkino and drive a wedge between IDF and the 3DF. The next day, from 0430 hours onward, hundreds of Soviet infantry supported by T-34S stormed Solomino. Soon the last POC in Solomino ceased to fire. The Soviets were temporarily thwarted by the timely arrival of the Sturmgeschütze of the Ritter Adler Brigade, which destroyed another 5 tanks. The Soviets, however, refused to give up, and by 1400 hours had conquered the village. With barely a pause, they drove onward, forcing IDF south toward Lebsino. On the 8th and 9th, 2 Soviet battalions and 4 tanks hammered at Lebsino. The tanks ran 2 light howitzers and 4 37 mm packs into the ground, but lost 3 of their own in the process. For now, the Soviets were unable to make further headway. At Lebsino, only 21 men remained in IDF and 25 men in the 1st and 3rd companies of the 251st Pioneer Battalion. There were also a handful of men from Berth 3DF, who had been pulled out of Klepanino on the 7th. When only 14 men and 28 wounded remained to defend Klepanino's southern ruins, Kum had given the order to evacuate the village. Only a single house remained standing. Destruction had not been wrought solely at Solomino, Lepsino, and Klepanino. The entire front was inflamed by Soviet attacks. Artillery flashes lit up the night sky in apocalyptic fury. Kum personally led many of the counterattacks in which a total of 24 enemy tanks were destroyed. His actions would earn him the Knight's Cross. The Deutschland Regiment arrives in support. More encouraging was the news that DF would receive 120 replacements. Better yet, their comrades from the HQ and 1st Battalion of the Deutschland Regiment of Des Reich, a total of 590 elite troops, would be arriving forthwith from Rzhev. On the 9th, the troopers of Deutschland disembarked from a column of troop carriers. They took position to the right of DF with Battalion HQ at Pedalino and Regimental HQ at Petuno. The arrival of Deutschland marked the beginning of a more profound shuffle of divisional fronts. During the 10th and 11th, 9th Army transferred the remainder of Des Reich from the Cauldron battle, and from the command of 46 Panzer Corps, das Reich was funneled into the critical sector of the 256th Infantry Division, from Petalino to Lepsino. The decimated Der Führer Regiment naturally left the command of the 256th and returned to its parent Das Reich Division. The 256th Infantry Division in turn took over the position of the 161st Infantry Division to the right. At the same time, Das Reich took over 10 formations already engaged in the sector, including 11 batteries of artillery. Lepsino, meanwhile, continued to be one of the hotspots. On February 11th, the Sektu IR 252 and Pi Beetle 251 were shoved out of Lepsino and from their positions to the east of the town. Fierce SS counterattacks by the remnants of IDF managed to regain the town's ruins, only to be again ejected by Soviet tanks. Kum ordered another attack, and incredibly by 13:45 hours Lepsino was again in German hands. 5 more Soviet tanks were left smoldering. Late that night in snowfall, the Soviet attack started anew. Savage battles raged all along the front. At Timonzewo, Soviet thrust continued to be blunted by the 1st Battalion of the Deutschland Regiment, which had resolutely led the local defense for the last several days. More problematic were the events in the Noshkino-Kirchdorf Russian Grove areas. New Soviet units, the 24th Ski Brigade and the 174th Rifle Division, were reported. By nightfall, in the midst of continuing blizzards, elements of the 371st and 171st Soviet Rifle Division, supported by 40 tanks, breached the defenses of the completely spent AA-256 at Noshkino. The battle for the Russian Grove. The Soviets also re-entered the Russian Grove, and to clear them out, Das Reich called upon its Kradschützen battalion. On February 12th, Hauptsturmführer Tixin, accompanied only by a signaler, was reconnoitering the ground ahead when he was seriously wounded in the chin by a grenade splinter. It was an evil omen for the next day's disastrous attacks. The SS failed to clear the thickets of Soviets and suffered 85 dead, including Untersturmführer, 2nd Lieutenant, Müller, Obersturmführer, 1st Lieutenant, Buch of the SS Kraj BTL left an account of the battle. Everything depended on the heavy weapons because the front was only thinly held. We sat in snow bunkers and during the day lay in heavy artillery fire. A pause in the artillery bombardment meant that the Russian attack was coming. Mostly one Russian company, never a battalion, pushed from the steep Volga bank through the Russian Grove and attempted to overrun the 4th Company. A hailstorm of machine gun, machine pistol, and hand grenade fire forced the enemy to take cover. Now was the time for the SS artillery to speak. Infantry guns and mortars pounded the Russians. Their attack having shattered the Russian artillery opened anew and the game began again, the soldier continued. Fortunately, we had enough ammunition. The infantry guns and the heavy mortars shot 600 rounds a day. The artillery fire could not be placed close enough because the worn-out barrels of some guns scattered their bombardment over 300 yards. Simultaneously, our attention was diverted to the north where the section of our neighbor was inflamed by renewed T-34 attacks. The Stugs of Stu.Gesh.Apt, 189 under WW2. Malachowski drove by us every time there was trouble to the north. In the beginning there were still 5 Stugs. Then there were less and less. They were glorious boys, those Stug gunners. On their returns they shouted out the tally of enemy tanks destroyed. 6 T-34s, or this time, only 3 T-34s. Das Reich historian and veteran Otto Weidinger's account of the fighting in the sector relates, "In the Russian Grove, the enemy is so well entrenched that it proves impossible to dislodge him. But the fire of a 21-seam mortar lobs a grenade into the wood every 4-7 minutes and keeps the enemy suppressed. During these days, the Kirchdorf, a small rise with its church and few buildings, changes possession 10 times, but in the end remains in the hands of AA 256. On February 14th, 20 Soviet Il-2 bombers pounded the entire front, from Petalino to Lipsino. The Sturmgeschütze of Opt 189 again proved their worth by nullifying a T-34 breakthrough at Lipsino. The next day, however, 8 T-34s and 2 rifle battalions ground their way into the village and threatened to push farther to the south. After the Sturmgeschütz destroyed 7 more Soviet tanks, the situation was somewhat relieved, but subsequent exertions failed to regain the village. The bodies of German troopers lay strewn among the burned-out Soviet tanks. Equally alarming was the loss of 2 Sturmgeschütze, 150 mm pack, and the only 88 mm flak gun used in the counterattack. Cauldron battle in South reaches its fateful climax. The Soviets achieved more success to the southeast, making gains in Noshkino and the Kirchdorf areas and pushing farther west to the Kastenwald and Eichwald. Their efforts were building to a feverish pitch because the Cauldron battle to the south was reaching its fateful climax. It was now or never if the trapped divisions were to be saved. Model, likewise, intensified the 9th Army's efforts to bring the battle to a close. At dawn on February 16th, Stuka dive bombers screamed down on the Soviet positions in Lipsino. Unfortunately for the Germans, the 2 remaining Sturmgeschütze that were to support the follow-up attack on Lipsino were stuck in the snow and could not be shoveled free until the early afternoon. With their narrow tracks and limited clearance, the German armored vehicles were poorly designed for winter combat. The Germans themselves, on the other hand, dubbed their chief enemy, the T-34, the Snow King. The attack was subsequently cancelled. The next day, those same Sturmgeschützewehr back in action, supporting the hard-pressed SS Kradschützen, resisting the Soviets in the Kirchdorf area. 4 more Soviet tanks were knocked out, but then the overstressed Sturmgeschütze broke down due to mechanical problems. Still, the Soviets proved unable to breach the paper-thin Kradschützen line. As usual, the SS paid a heavy price. Hauptsturmführer Grünwalder joined many of his troopers in death, and the battalion was reduced to 70 men. Hours later, after some quick repairs, the Sturmgeschütze umbled north to rejoin the delayed counterattack on Lipsino. Stuka bombardment plowed up the Soviet defenses, and by 1710 hours Lipsino was back in German hands, but not for long. Another Soviet counterattack with 7 tanks and 200 men drove the 60 Germans out of the village, which by now had become a mass grave for many German and Soviet soldiers. Finally, in a last-minute exertion to save their doomed comrades, 6 Soviet tanks burst through das Reich's lines. The SS Grenadiers took care of the Soviet infantry that followed in the tanks' wake, but nothing was able to stop the tanks themselves. They kept going all the way into the back of the 1st Panzer Division, which was busy eliminating the Cauldron. The brave efforts of the Soviet tank men were in vain. Model himself took the matter in hand and destroyed 5 of the tanks with a deadly artillery barrage. Late in the afternoon of February 17th, Kumm received a heartening message from Matthias Kleinheisterkamp, the Das Reich Division commander. The enemy in the Sikevka cauldron is destroyed. Der Führer will be taken out of the front line the following day. Orders followed for the 251st Infantry Division to take over Das Reich's entire section. Das Reich's formations gathered west of Rzhev and went into Army Reserve. The Soviets took a beating. After the 17th, almost like magic, Soviet attacks on Das Reich's sector trickled to a halt. Sporadic fighting continued nevertheless, as the tenacious Soviets refused to relinquish any of their hard-fought gains. However, it was clear that the battle had run its course. The Soviet 30th Army gave its all against long odds as the soldiers of Das Reich on the Wehrmacht persevered. It was time for both sides to lick their wounds, and those wounds were deep. Caught in the cauldron, the Soviet 29th Army was virtually obliterated. The mangled Soviet 39th Army and the 11th Cavalry Corps barely escaped the same fate and were trying to escape southwest under cover of woods and darkness. 6 Soviet divisions were shattered, 4 nearly so, and 9 others plus 5 tank brigades badly mauled. On the Soviet side, 27,000 had died and 5,000 marched into captivity. A total of 187 Soviet tanks, 343 infantry guns, 256 anti-tank guns, and 7 anti-aircraft guns were destroyed or captured. To this was added the tally of the 8th Flieger Corps, Air Corps, which accounted for 68 enemy aircraft, 4 tanks, 28 guns, and over 300 trucks. The beating taken by the Soviet 30th Army in its relief efforts was only a little less severe, as Otto Kumm relates in his book Kameraden bis zum Ende, Comrades Till the End. During these weeks, the enemy has lost 15,000 dead in front of the regiment's section. Through the exact knowledge of the Soviet regimental numbers and repeated questionings of prisoners, it was possible to determine the casualties of the Russian battalions and regiments. At the same time, 70 enemy tanks were shot down in the regiment's section, not counting tanks that broke through and were destroyed by other German elements. A valiant German defensive stand Kumm praised the many battalions that were placed under DF's command, especially the splendid cooperation from the 5 AR-256 Battery, the Sturmgeschütze of Malachowski's Ritter Adler Brigade, and the AA-256, whose Major Mummert was awarded the Knight's Cross on Kumm's recommendation. On November 4, 1942, the Knight's Cross was also awarded to Das Reich Divisional Commander Matthias Kleinheisterkamp. Bieler, the commander of 6th Corps, wrote in his war diary, "The heroic deeds of every soldier who fought in the hells of Klepenino, Solomino, Lebsino, Noshkino, Kirchdorf, and Timonzewo are above praise and forever will go into the history of the German Ostheer." Model was visiting the Das Reich Divisional Headquarters when Otto Kumm personally reported in. Model addressed Kumm. "I know what your regiment went through, Kumm, but I still can't do without it. How strong is it now?" Kumm pointed to the window. "Sir Colonel General, my regiment is on parade outside." Model looked outside. There stood 35 men. At Rzhev, the soldiers of Das Reich paid homage to the SS accolade, "Your honor is loyalty," with their deaths. As heavy as the German sacrifices were, Model had reversed 2 months of defeats, saved the 9th Army, and in conjunction with the German successes south of Wismar, saved Army Group Center. In the latter area, however, it was not until the spring that the penetrating Soviet armies were smashed in the Great Battle of the Ugra Bend. Model paid respect to his soldiers in the 9th Army with the following message: "Every leader and soldier of the army takes credit for our victory. Like an unbreakable shield, our defense held out in the east and north so that the sword of our counterattack could strike to destroy the enemy. Today, the Führer has bestowed upon me the oak leaves to my knight's cross. I will carry it in thankful pride of you, soldiers of the Ninth Army, especially of those who gave their lives to fulfill our mission. The bloody reversal of the Soviet winter offensive against AGC was mirrored by unachieved objectives to the north and south. General Georgy Zhukov commented on the Vyazma battles. We overrated our own driving force and underestimated that of the enemy, who proved a much harder nut to crack than we had supposed. Zhukov had wisely counseled from the start that the Red Army did not have the resources to achieve victory everywhere, but an overeager Stalin had not listened to him. Nevertheless, the great German defensive victories could not disguise the fact that the Wehrmacht had failed to capture Moscow. The war would go on. For the troopers of 2nd SS Division Das Reich, their comrades in the Wehrmacht and their Soviet foes, there would be no rest. Inexorably, total defeat would come. Ludwig Dick has written on numerous occasions for sovereign media publications. He has done extensive research on World War II on the Eastern Front and resides in Richmond, British Columbia, Canada.